You're nervous, holding the phone in a cold sweat. The client is mad. They're on the phone threatening to axe the project and not pay for the work done so far. Everything had been going so well. They were totally chilled out, and so were you. They wanted their site redesigned, sounded simple, and you didn't really bother with writing anything down because, well, it just felt like everyone got it. Everyone was chill. And now they're not. What they actually thought they were getting was a rebrand on top of that redesigned website. Now your stomach is in knots because you know you screwed this up. Nothing was written down and it's their word against yours. Now, I'm just stressed out saying this. So if you want a whole bunch less stress, keep listening to this podcast to discover why scope statements are so important, how to write them and use them for your project. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Aston, founder of The Digital Project Manager. Welcome to the DPM podcast. We're on a mission to help project managers succeed, to help people who manage projects deliver better. We're here to help you take your project game to the next level. Check out thedigitalprojectmanager.com to learn about our training and resources we offer through membership. This podcast is brought to you by Clarizen, the leader in enterprise project and portfolio management software. Visit clarizen.com to learn more. So today I'm joined by Robyn, and Robyn is one of our resident DPM experts, and conveniently, she lives just down the road from me in Portland, where I read recently she likes emojis, list making, and puppies. So she's a chef turned project manager with more than 10 years project management experience in agencies and startups. And she's also actually about to become more available to take on contracting work. So if you're looking for a contract PM, track her down on LinkedIn. But hey, Robyn, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, Ben. Always good to be with you.
Now, I want to start actually with going back to that list making and puppies. Have you made a list today?
I have. I actually, I'm such a dork. I have one list for today's top goals. I have one list in my planner, and then I also have my Google Calendar. So apparently I need 3 different lists at any one time. And what you can't see behind me is my crime wall of Post-it notes.
Oh, and that's like the back catalog of lists?
Things in different categories that I am trying to achieve personally and professionally, or even, just different content ideas for you.
There we go. So, do you have a puppy with you as well?
I do have my 8-year-old puppy, but obviously I love dogs way more than cats, and everybody can hate on me for that. Emojis I feel less enthusiastic about lately, but I think that was just a phase.
That was so last year. Yeah.
I don't know.
So obviously, Post-its lists are a big deal for you. You find them inspiring, but I'm curious as to where you get inspired. What are you reading? What are you consuming right now to get inspired and stay inspired?
Oh, this is a great question, and I feel like I could talk for like 30 minutes about this one. But right now, obviously, the Digital Project Manager is a constant source of inspiration. I took a short pause from being as heavily involved in that Slack community, and now that I'm back, I kind of missed a lot of my friends there, and that's been a complete joy. But also locally through my friends in my community. But I do want to do a shout out to one of a really great Portland community groups that I've been involved with through the years is called PDX WIT, which is Portland Women in Technology. And I just really appreciate that community that's been organizing really well put together skill building events, mentorship, and access to jobs and communities. And they've really taught me a lot about diversity and inclusion. And so I highly encourage all of you to kind of create something similar to that or check them out at pdxwit.org.
That's cool. And what are you trying to get better at? Like, we've all got a bit more time on our hands at the moment. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I'm being inundated with masterclass and fitness and all kinds of things. But as you're thinking about, what's inspiring you, what are you being inspired to do? Is there anything that you're particularly working on a new hobby you're taking up, a new coding language you're diving into? What are you doing?
Well, recently I haven't worked in Drupal for like, I don't know, 7 years. So kind of catching up where that is at. But outside of that, I think this, and Ben, you've known me for years. This feels almost like a real true secret to share out loud with you, is that I'm thinking about actually getting different certifications.
Oh,
So like actually getting my PMP, or actually taking, I think it's like, safe.
yeah,
I
Agile.
forget
Yeah,
what it is, but like kind of exploring if that is something I want to do moving forward, just kind of being more exposed to those methodologies versus kind of remaining fine with where I'm at.
that's cool. Well, good luck with that one. And anything else that you've discovered recently that is making your life more awesome? It's the little things right now. What is
Mhm.
making, what's bringing a smile to your face? What's bringing you a moment of joy?
This is also embarrassing. I feel like I don't know why I'm so embarrassed today, but I have really been enjoying like working from home, and in the background I put on this one station on YouTube TV, which I have a subscription to, and it's like 100% surf channel. And living in Portland, like, it takes me an hour and a half to get to the beach. I'm not a surfer. I don't know anything about surfing, but I've really enjoyed watching apparently ambient surf TV championships in the background. And now I'm obsessed with so many different people like Andy Irons and the Kelly Slater debacle. And it's just, I've learned a lot from it, which is the weirdest, latest thing making my life awesome.
Who is your favorite surfer?
Definitely Kelly Slater.
Do you know what? When I was in
Pretty basic.
Hawaii, well, yeah, that was a good, that was a safe option. When I was, my claim to fame is I went surfing with Kelly Slater in Hawaii. Kind
Um,
of.
you can't just say kind of, that doesn't work.
Well, we were coming out the water and he was going in the water with his girlfriend, and we crossed and said hi, Kelly. So we went surfing with him, right?
Yes. You were in
Yeah,
the water at the same time.
yeah. I mean, that's as
It
close as
sounds
it
like you were
gets.
on some big waves though, if you're like out there with Kelly. So
Yeah, yeah. It was Hawaii. So yeah, my claim to fame. So I mean, let's get back to this serious topic. Moving away from the beach, back to scope statements, and let's start with why. I mean, I tried to set the scene at the beginning with why we should care about scope statements. Projects go wrong. There are misunderstandings that happen. And scope statements can save our bacon. But I mean, let's start with your why. Have you got any horror stories of not having scope statements like I talked about in the intro? Why do scope statements get you excited?
Oh, absolutely. And I think just even hearing your intro moments ago, I was really thinking about how that trauma came back to me and how it will always come back. So, scope statements are super important because it's where you ensure your team and your client has a clear understanding of what the overarching requirements are, and ultimately it's going to define how you're going to fail and how that would work. The thing we're trying to protect here is opening yourself up for conflict with the client, with your internal team, and then also just trying to align everybody and avoid litigation there.
Yeah. So we are trying as much as possible to clarify and unify our understanding. And I think what scope statements are great for is codifying that understanding. And I think sometimes we can think, hey, we're all on the same page. We're all friends here. It's often worse actually when you are friends, because everyone can just assume that everyone else is understanding one another. And then there are sneaky
Oh,
words
totally.
like, update or refresh that are really ambiguous. And what the scope statements do is reduce that ambiguity in the gray areas and make things a lot more black and white.
Absolutely. And I think, even in the 10 years I've been working in this space, those terminologies change, even on, a quarterly basis, right? And I think before we really talk about like what they are and how they are, I just kind of want to share that, you know, writing a scope statement is really underappreciated in this role. It's the driest thing about the gig. And typically, this is the hardest part to kick off your project. Like, nobody wants to have ownership about it. It's your thing to do. But I just want to state that personally, I love it because, well, I mean, I'm pretty nerdy, but putting in this time at the beginning of the project ensures a really efficient future onset for that project.
Definitely. So, I mean, let's talk about it at its most basic for people who are like, hold on a second, what is a scope statement? How would you describe a scope statement?
Yeah, so I think there's this wide swath of different terminologies that we can use, just as you were mentioning, Ben, about, refresh versus redesign, right? And how are they different from the SOW? So, Ben, I think we can go back and forth about this, but how I understand a scope statement is simply a way to describe the work you're agreeing to deliver. And it describes, at the most fundamental elements, the constraints or limitations of the project, right? So we're going to talk about what's being delivered, what's not being delivered, assumptions about what you're going to deliver, and then any additional clarifications.
Yeah. So the scope statement. Yeah. So the scope statements we use to describe the work, we're defining the scope and we're codifying the scope. We're saying, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what we're not doing. And sometimes if we can't define what we're doing or not doing, we're at least describing the process and what that process can look like. And people sometimes ask, hey, well, do I need a statement of work, or what does an agile statement of work look like? And I think this is a big challenge, right? We still need to define what we're doing and what we're not doing. But instead of defining the deliverables, what we can do is target that outcome we're trying to get to and the process that we're going to follow to get or try to get to that outcome.
Absolutely. And I think, piggybacking on that, there's some basics you should follow, right? And we'll talk about some tips for that. But there's not just one template that every digital project manager is following. There's not just one thing that everybody's doing, and you can't just copy and paste it. So every business is different. Every project or program is different. And what we're seeking here is just consistency to cover your back, right? Or as I put it in that article, your bacon, right? Because you need to protect your team. You need to protect that business initiative.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if you got any stories of how you didn't define the scope statements as fully as you needed to or should have, and what happened.
Well, I think this is a slippery slope because I have in previous roles been advised not to put a lot of detail in because that could potentially open you up for legal litigation, right? If you put in too much, right? So we can kind of fight back and forth a little bit more if it's more gray area. But where I've found my most success is putting in as much detail as you possibly can. So whether that be waterfall, whether that be agile, like define everything you know within that statement and then cross-check that with the client. So we can get into more horror stories later, but I think over the years of experience, like you're not going to do it perfect sometimes. And you're going to have a client that figures something out different. And it's just about navigating that landscape and putting in that time up front as best you can. But we've all got horror stories.
Yeah. So my horror story is when I think I've shared this before, but we were working with a large consumer electronics client and creating some custom animations for them. And the client wanted to make sure that we'd bought the rights to the animation. So we did. And I think we bought like a 5-year all media buyout. So we could use the animations in whatever way we wanted for 5 years, which was, we were just creating this animation for a single campaign. And so, we only needed it for a year max. So we thought, we'll just buy it for 5 in case we wanted to reuse it next year. And later down the line, the client comes back to us and says, hold on, like, I asked you to buy the rights for this. And we're like, yeah, we did. And he's like, no, but we need them like in perpetuity. Like, we want to be able to use them forever in any media, in any format. And we'd only bought it for 5 years, which became a huge sticking point because then the animation studio who produced this for us, well, knew that they had us, they could charge us anything. So they tried to, and in the end, this whole actual client relationship became completely undone off the back of this one scope statement, which wasn't fully defined. And that was just around how long the buyout would be for the animations from the third party. And it undid the whole client relationship just from that one scope statement. So it can be, these things can have massive consequences when there's this small misunderstanding that can really rattle people sometimes. And sometimes people just pick fights because they can, which was the case with this. They didn't really need it, in perpetuity, but that's what they wanted. So they threw their toys out the pram. So these are things to take really seriously, because not only can they sink the project, they can sink the whole client relationship. But let's talk about actually writing these scope statements and the process that you go through. How do you actually make them up? How do you decide how to write that scope statement? You talked about, not making it too specific. And the advantage of that is it leaves a bit open to interpretation, which can be good. Or you can be really detailed and try and cover every possible scenario. So how do you go about writing the scope statements?
Well, 3 things before we even talk about that. 1, I am not a lawyer. I do not provide formal legal advice. So I'm just talking about my experiences, mainly from my career in advertising, right? Secondly,
don't sue Robyn.
Yeah, I am not a lawyer. Number 2, I want to send you some love about that, Ben, because ouch. Yep. I totally know those perpetuity terms. And I think, that contrast between 1 year and 5 year and perpetuity is really dramatically different. And I think, there was a healthy lesson in that. What I want to go back to though is kind of, within our environments that we work in, scope statements are a lot of different things, right? So we can call them estimates. We can call them the whole darn scope of work. We can call them a contract. We can call them a proposal. It's essentially like a nest of things that go within several different formats. So some of the names I've used before is statement of work, contracts, proposals, scope of works, like we talked about, but they are not an NDA, an MSA, an ICA, or an LSA or SLA. And you can hear more about that in my article and what those definitions are. So basically just trying to point out that this isn't the only thing you need to be providing with your client. Right. It's just a component of that.
Definitely.
Okay, so back to your original question. I think you were just asking, how do I make them, write them? What's my process?
Yeah.
Well, knowing me, there's a few different approaches. I typically have used templates that's already provided by my in-house team. Luckily, I've been provided a lot of really great workplaces that already have a template on hand. I also do keep versions of previous SOWs in a personal folder, so I can pull back and see, how did I craft, a scope or a statement that referenced a branding project versus a digital project versus a refresh right. or a redesign. But obviously, I think the digital project manager is a great resource for that. And Ben, I know that you wrote an awesome article about writing a statement of work. That does include a template, so you can kind of source a lot of details there too.
Definitely. Cool. So, and I think this idea of developing your own bank of scope statements that you can, reduce, reuse, recycle, is super important, because the way that we talk about delivering work is actually, normally the parameters that we're having to describe if we're doing a rebrand project are going to be the same project to project. We're going to be talking about how many concepts we're developing, how many rounds of revision we'll be doing, what that client interaction and feedback loop might look like, what the final deliverables might be. Actually, the kind of, if we're producing the same kind of deliverables time and time again and going through the same process, then the scope statements that we're writing can actually be recycled quite easily. So actually, in the post, if you've not checked it out yet, go to the digitalprojectmanager.com project scope statement, and you'll see a whole bunch of scope statements that we have. Some of them are generic. So some of them you can actually reuse and recycle for your own projects and just change the names out. And then some of them are more specific. So for the more specific ones, we have to have this understanding of what the project is. But some of them, like scope statements that we can recycle project to project, are scope statements like defining who's going to pay for or who's going to be responsible for licensing imagery or videos, or who's going to be or what the turnaround time might be for a client to approve a piece of work or review and provide consolidated feedback, or how many rounds of approvals there might be. So some of these scope statements, you can just create a bank of them. We've got a whole bunch on the article that you can just recycle. Some of them we're going to have to be more specific about. But let's talk about good and bad scope statements. We talked about there's two ways, I guess, of doing this. Either you can go, well, maybe it's a continuum of a loose scope statement versus a very specific scope statement. Now, it's not necessarily good and bad, either end of that continuum. But what do you think makes a good or bad scope statement?
Ooh, that's a big question. But I don't know. We could spend hours talking about that, right? I think what I do really appreciate what you were saying earlier, though, is like to lean on that bank of your different scope statements in the past, and also lean upon others in your current workplace, or reach out to different friends and ask if they have something similar that was super effective, so that you're not always starting from scratch, right? Like lean on this DPM community, lean on people so you don't have to start all over. But I can tell you some 5 things you can do to cover your bacon. Do you want to hear that, Ben?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. And this is just coming from my personal experience, but what I find really successful is to, number one, define why. I typically like to call this part the overview. It just feels a little bit more formal, but this is essentially the first section where you're defining the work and defines why this project exists or program, why it's happening, and what it will achieve, right? So we've all had overviews in our essays growing up. We're using that here in present day as adults. I typically like to delegate this out to an account manager if you have that, so they can go run that back to the client and get those KPIs that we can talk about. This is not where we need to narrate everything. I keep it short and concise, but we just need to frame up essentially that value statement that will outline the rest of why we're doing this work and why it's important that we can level back up to this why.
Yeah, and I think this, starting with the why, is super important, just because if all else fails, this is kind of our backstop. If we can demonstrate that actually, well, we delivered on the original intent of, and it delivers on that why. So if it's about, fundamentally, what we're trying to do is build something that, increases the number of subscribers. Well, the client might not like the way that we executed it, but if ultimately we can prove and show that, yes, it does exactly that we are building the subscribers and that works. If we can align at the most basic level on achieving that why and reaching that outcome, then it provides us with some common ground to work from.
Absolutely. And I think that can be worked in all project methodologies, right, of how we're tackling this, right? You need to always know why we're proceeding forward. And I found it's really helpful to kind of put at the top of a Slack channel or in different team documentation as well. And so kind of craft that, own that, and then share it with everybody to align the teams. The second tip I have for you, though, is to outline the approval process. And this may seem really basic, but I feel like this is always where in the past things have gotten a little spicy. So I'm highly encouraging you to at least craft basic language that details out the approval process for deliverables. So for example, when should the client give us feedback? Who is providing that feedback and how should it be delivered? Obviously, you can start basic within this statement for now, but know that it should be expanded upon before everything's moving in motion. I think Ben and we both have had a few headaches here in obtaining feedback and how, and we can also talk about how we tuck this under dependencies and assumptions in the future But it's best, I've found, to always talk about feedback and that approval process with the client verbally, and then have written format for that within that statement.
Definitely. Yeah, that's solid advice.
Okay, moving on to the third tip is, I would highly suggest, champion, that you identify what you're actually going to be delivering. And typically, this will be the biggest part of your scope statement. And this is a wild west, right? It could be super detailed and expansive if you're doing more waterfall. It could be more process focused if it's more of an agile approach. But what it's going to do is it's going to list exactly what people are getting, when they're getting it, and how they're getting it. I come from the standpoint of trying to be detailed, but as I know, everybody doesn't agree with that. But I am super passionate about rounds of review, content entry, migration, hosting and configuration, formal QA. Also, Ben speaking to like image rights, and then ultimately deployment.
Yeah, and I'm also a firm believer in, hey, if we can define this, let's define it. Let's try and block in the canvas. And this is where I think if you don't know exactly what you are going to deliver, I would adopt the sandbag approach, which is, hey, we know at the very least we're going to deliver this. And then we can at least level set on that understanding that at the very least we'll deliver 2 concepts. If you think you're going to develop 4, say you'll develop 2 and commit to doing 2, because it might turn out that for whatever reason you do only deliver 2. If you think, hey, you can build, up to 5 components within the page, well, let's define 5 and let's agree to 5, even if you think, well, it might be actually 6 or 7. So sandbagging can be a good way to find some common ground that's the most likely, that kind of aligns with that most likely outcome. And that means that you don't need to say, hey, well, we're going to deliver 7 modules. But you say, hey, we'll deliver 5. And then you can surprise and delight. And make sure that you're not overcommitting yourself. And I think that's the key part to writing this scope statement. And when we're defining the deliverables, we just don't want to overcommit ourselves, because the danger is if we say 7 and it turns out we only needed 5, then the client might turn around and say, well, can I get a refund, please? Because you actually only ended up doing 5.
And that's absolutely happened to me. I think it can really help control what's happening internally with your team. So you may have someone, design and development or 2, really, I love that intersection of creative and development, but sometimes they disagree on that workload. So your designer might go crazy. Your UXer might figure out, your strategist might say, okay, we need 20 templates, right? And so by kind of having these upfront discovery conversations, we can try to mitigate that internal churn as well, not just on the client end.
Definitely.
So Ben, you were alluding to the 4th tip that I have, which is to define what is included and what's not included. And typically, I put this in a different section outside of what those deliverables are. So after I've identified, like, yes, you will get 3 modules, for example, this is definitely where I have an exhaustive list just to try to protect what I know and what I don't know. I call it boundaries, if we think about it in personal terms. But this is where I'm covering my bacon. So first up, I like to have dependencies and assumptions, is technically what I like to call it within these statements. But here's what you spell out where nobody's going to get away with. So this section may repeat back on a few things above in your statement, such as written feedback and who it should come from and that relationship. But in addition, it could be like, for example, if there's multiple deployments, if they decide they don't want to move forward with the deployment, this is where you outline, like, if you push out the deployment date, there will be a change order issued,
right? Because
that's going to take additional time for the team and reshuffling your resources or people to get there, which is important. And in my article, I list out some exhaustive examples for you. And then secondly, I love the section called exclusion statements, or as I call it, out of scope. And this is everything that you think that they might ask for and you want to make clear that you're not providing. So Ben, going back to that image fees and perpetuity, this is talking about CMS training documentation, hosting your font fees, digital style guide. Like it can go on forever, but you're just trying to protect yourself that you're not on the hook for providing that because you didn't talk about it.
Yeah, or maybe you did talk about it, and that's where these misunderstandings can occur. These are also called negative scope statements. So we're just listing out all the things that we're definitely not doing. And I think what can sometimes happen in that process of defining the project brief and defining the project, it might be that the client comes to you and says, hey, well, we want to revamp our website. And they talk about rebranding as well. But it turns out that actually in the statement of work where you net out at, they don't have the budget for a complete rebrand. So you need to include a scope statement or a negative scope statement that says, we will not be doing any rebranding. And that will, then you can refer back to it and say, hey, client, I know, you seem to think that we were going to do a rebrand, but we did write it down here in the scope as a scope statement to say we will not be doing any rebrand work on this project. So it's worth thinking about as we're trying to write these negative scope statements, as we're trying to anticipate what are all the things that the client could think they might be getting, but they're not getting. Refer back to all those conversations you've had and think, what were some of the crazy ideas that they threw out there, and make sure that you include them in your list of things that you're not doing.
I love that. Yeah. And I don't think there's any right way to do this. It's just more of kind of like trusting your inner gut and listing out what are all the ways that this could go poorly. And I've had managers in the past that are like, Robyn, you've written down, like, you catastrophized essentially way too much. And so I think for me, like kind of mapping out what could go wrong and then summarizing that a little bit more concisely is also helpful, because that's me, being in my craft, thinking ahead, trying to mitigate that risk at the very beginning stage of the project. I think we're ready to move on to the fifth and final tip, which is a little controversial potentially, but I like to make a scope statement matrix. And so I came up with this a few years ago, and I think it was passed over to me from somebody else too. But what I realized is that I have spent hours in the past in an active project just going through version histories of documents or files or Slack or email or sketch files or, God forbid, code, just to figure out exactly what we sent, what that format was. And it's not clear. Like, I've wasted a lot of project hours doing that. And so I've learned that at the onset of delivering that scope statement, I can do the work up front and just keep track of deliverables, just so that we have a clear understanding of how we're executing against that statement.
Yeah. So the idea of this is that because sometimes these deliverables that we're producing, that statement of work, we want it to become a document that's not just a one-time thing, but this is one way that we can actually make the statement of work relevant throughout the project. So by putting those deliverables into a matrix and kind of tracking with them, reminding the client or the stakeholders that, hey, this is a document we're taking seriously, this is a document we're using, that can be a great way to track things as we go and to keep the document and the conversation about it alive.
Correct. And Ben, I would even go so much to say is I have not always shared these matrices with the client directly. Sometimes I just keep them within the project file structure, right, internally, but I kind of like bring it out when that contention potentially comes up so that I have all the resources needed to mitigate that issue immediately instead of spending the hours in the past.
Yeah. So, I mean, this all sounds like plain sailing, right? If you follow these tips and just use your scope statements, all will go wonderfully well, right or wrong? So tell us what some of the biggest challenges you've had, or where do scope statements go wrong?
I think where things haven't worked is essentially it's not about always following quote, quote, the rules, but you need to be flexible about approaching every project individually, right? I think what's hasn't worked for me is if I'm like, I think back to years ago and I'm like, okay, well, this is the template. I always follow the template. And I think we just need to be more flexible about how we approach every project and understanding that clients are on different levels of how they want to approach things. And that's usually where it's been a problem. Just my own learnings. And so I think over the past years, I've been more flexible about it, but also more rigid in terms of what we actually are signing up to do.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges is really, I think in just defining how definitive you're going to be, like how well, when you start the project, when you're trying to write a scope statement and you're not entirely sure what you're delivering, it can be tricky because you can be tempted to, you can overreach and you can say, hey, yeah, right at the beginning of the project, well, we think we're going to deliver X, Y, and Z. And then it turns out after the discovery phase or after the design phase that the Z part of the project is kind of redundant. It's not needed or not necessary, or you can't afford it. So I think it's always worth thinking about your planning horizon. And it's good to write scope statements, but not to overreach. And maybe split your scope statements up into realistic chunks that are within your planning horizon. So if you're going into the discovery phase, just try and get away with writing the scope statements for the discovery phase, and then say, hey, as part of this phase of the project, we're then going to develop the next part of the project, the scope and the scope statements for the craft phase or the design phase of the project. So I think overreaching, is potentially the biggest challenge that I see when we're developing these, because we think we know stuff, we think we can anticipate what's going to happen, but so often we can't.
Absolutely. I think another challenge just kind of like came to me right now is when you get a sign off on that scope statement from the client, but they haven't involved all of their stakeholders on that. And that can really detriment your project. And so just having that verbal walkthrough and kind of alignment session where you talk about that, I think is super helpful.
Definitely. And I think what's important there is the verbal walkthrough, because I think what we don't want clients to do as well is to sign it off and to have read it themselves and not to have understood it. We want them to understand what they've committed to, because what we don't want is we don't want this to be a legal document. We don't want this we want this just to be to facilitating a conversation, to level set on expectations. So we don't ever want it to come to, well, let's go to court and discuss what this statement of work actually really means and have a judge or a jury interpret whether or not it was delivered. That's not the point of this. The point of this is all about alignment, to get on the same page, so that it's a conversation tool, so that when we talk to the client, when we talk them through these scope statements, we're not trying to trick them. We're not trying to kind of cheat them out of the work, but we're just trying to level set. We're trying to get on the same page so that when we do the work, when we deliver those outputs, they're going to be happy with the outcome of the project and the things that we're producing. So try not to think of this as a legal document, because if it goes that far, then you've failed, and probably everybody's going to lose money. You're probably going to lose the client. We don't want to get to that point. What we want to do is level set on expectations so that everybody is happy with the way the work is done and the way the work is being produced. So that's my big takeaway, I think, from our conversation today.
Yeah. And Ben, I think there's nothing more amazing than that feeling where you can actually copy paste that scope statement into a legal binding document, and just making sure that, yes, that word is my favorite one, aligned between the client and internal parties.
Definitely. Let's get some alignment. So Robyn, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great having you with us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'd love to know, for you who are listening, what are your tips and tricks for scope statements? Do you use statements of work? Where do you put your scope statements? How do you produce them? What works? What doesn't? Let us know in the comments. Let us know your fail stories and wins. And if you want to learn more and get ahead in your work, come and join our tribe with DPM membership. Head to thedigitalprojectmanager.com/membership to get access to our Slack team, masterminds, mentorship, templates, workshops, office hours, AMA sessions, ebooks, and more. And if you like what you heard today, please subscribe and stay in touch on thedigitalprojectmanager.com. But until next time, thanks so much for listening.